Imagine being 24 years old, thousands of feet above the ground, strapped inside the tail section of a World War II bomber that's just been torn apart in midair. There's smoke, fire, chaos, and then silence. The tail of the plane is falling, and you're falling with it. No parachute, no control, just you, gravity, and the horrifying realization that this might be the end. That was a reality for Sergeant Alan McGee, a young American airman aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress on a mission over Nazi-occupied France. He wasn't a superhero, not someone born with 9 lives or special powers. He was just a regular kid from New Jersey who found himself in the most unthinkable situation. What happened next defies logic, science, and all reasonable expectation. Instead of dying, Alan survived the 22,000-foot fall. Yes, you heard that right. He lived. But this story isn't just about the miracle of surviving an impossible fall. It's about what survival really means. It's about what happens when everything breaks. Your body, your plans, your sense of safety. And somehow, you wake up on the other side of the wreckage still breathing. It's a story about how pain doesn't always mean the end, and how sometimes the very fall that should have killed you becomes the beginning of a greater purpose. Maybe you've had moments where it felt like your whole world fell apart, where life hit you so hard, you didn't think you'd get back up. That's why this story matters. Because if Alan McGee can walk away from a fall through the sky and find purpose on the other side, maybe the things trying to break you right now aren't the end of your story. Maybe they're the beginning of a miracle. This isn't just a war story. It's a soul story. And it might just change how you see your life forever. In the skies over Europe during World War II, the roar of the B-17 Flying Fortress became a symbol of both hope and devastation. Nicknamed the Flying Fortress for its ability to take brutal punishment and still stay in the air, the B-17 was an engineering marvel of its time. With 4 powerful engines, heavy armor, and 13.50 caliber machine guns strategically placed around its body, it was designed to fly deep into enemy territory, drop bombs on strategic targets, and somehow survive the storm of flak and enemy fighters that filled the skies. Crewed by 10 men, each with a role as critical as the next, the B-17 was more than just a plane. It was a home in the sky, a war machine powered by courage, and a coffin waiting for the unlucky. Among the most vulnerable positions on the B-17 was a tail gunner seat located in the very rear of the aircraft. Cramped, cold, and isolated, the tail gunner's job was to defend the bomber's 6 o'clock position from attacking aircraft. These gunners were often the last line of defense, staring death in the face through a tiny window with twin .50 calibers blazing. They had no exit route, no easy escape if the aircraft was hit, and little chance of survival if the tail was damaged. They flew at altitude so high that temperatures could plummet to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and oxygen masks were required to breathe. And if enemy flak or a German Focke-Wulf 190 fighter found its mark, the tail section could be blown away in an instant, along with the soul inside it. Yet these young men flew anyway. They strapped themselves into metal boxes held together by rivets and hope, knowing each mission might be their last. For many it was. Of the tens of thousands of B-17s that flew missions during the war, over 4,700 were lost in combat. Thousands of men never made a home, their names etched into history as symbols of sacrifice. But there was something special about the spirit of the B-17 crews, something more than duty or orders. It was brotherhood, it was grit, it was a shared belief that even if they didn't make it back, the mission mattered. They knew they were striking at the heart of tyranny. They knew their flights were part of something larger than themselves. And despite the dangers, despite the fear that clawed at their chests every time the engine started, they went up again and again. On one of these missions, fly over the town of St. Nazaire in France, a key German submarine base, Sergeant Alan McGee took his place in the tail of the B-17 snap, crackle, pop. Unaware that this particular mission would change the trajectory of his life in the most dramatic way. As the formation approached the target, the sky lit up with bursts of enemy flak. Black puffs of smoke appeared like poison clouds, and tracer rounds streaked past like lightning in the daylight. In the chaos of bombardment, the B-17 was hit hard. The tail section was torn loose from the rest of the aircraft, and McGee, still strapped in and possibly unconscious from oxygen deprivation or the impact, began a free fall that would carry him over 4 miles down toward the earth. For most, this is where the story would end. But not for McGee. Not for this tail gunner who had taken his place in the belly of the beast. His fall wasn't a conclusion. It was the beginning. Before we dive into what happened during those terrifying seconds of descent, before we talk about the miracle that would shock even the most skeptical minds, we need to understand this. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just a machine, it was a crucible. It tested every man who flew it. It burned away fear and exposed courage, often in the most painful ways. To understand Alan McGee's story is to understand the brutal, beautiful reality of the Flying Fortress. It was majestic in the sky and monstrous in its demands. It gave no guarantees, only missions. And inside it, men like McGee found themselves not only facing the enemy, but facing the edges of their own mortality. The Flying Fortress could fly with engines on fire, wings torn, holes in its fuselage, and still make a home. There are stories of B-17s landing with only one engine, or with the tail section barely hanging on by a few metal threads. These aircraft became legends and the men inside them, living testaments to human endurance. But even the fortress had its limits. When the flak was too close, when the enemy fighters were too many, and when fate had other plans, the B-17 could be torn apart in seconds. And that's exactly what happened over France when McGee's plane was hit. In that instant, everything changed. A boy who had enlisted to serve his country, who probably still had pictures of home in his pocket and dreams about the future in his heart, was suddenly thrown into a nightmare that defied imagination. The metal cage that once offered him a fighting chance became a coffin in freefall. The fortress had broken. The sky had opened up beneath him, and the story of a miracle had just begun. Alan McGee wasn't born a legend. He was just a young man from Plainfield, New Jersey, raised during the hardships of the Great Depression, shaped by quiet resilience, a strong sense of duty, and an ordinary American dream. Like many young men of his time, he found himself swept up in the storm of World War II, not because he craved glory, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. He enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces in 1941, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and trained as an airman in one of the most dangerous positions aboard a bomber, the tail gunner. Thin, wiry, and determined, McGee didn't look like someone built to survive war, but inside him was something far stronger than muscle. A quiet grit, an inner toughness that wouldn't be revealed until everything around him fell apart. His training was brutal, the expectations high, and the margin for error razor thin. As a tail gunner, McGee would be isolated at the rear of the aircraft in a tight, freezing compartment, with only a plexiglass bubble between him and the enemy fighters screaming toward the bomber at 400 miles per hour. Every time the mission alarm sounded, McGee suited up knowing full well that tail gunners were often the first to die if the plane went down. Yet he showed up, strapped in, and fought with calm determination. Those who served with him described him as quiet, but deeply focused, the kind of guy who wouldn't say much, but you want him next to you when things got ugly. It's likely that, like many others in the squadron, McGee carried a photograph of loved ones tucked into his flight jacket or a small keepsake, a lucky coin, a cross, a note from home, to remind him of what he was fighting for. He flew with the 360th Bomb Squadron, part of the 303rd Bomb Group, a unit stationed in England that conducted relentless bombing raids over occupied Europe. Their targets were Nazi supply lines, U-boat bases, and industrial strongholds, missions that were vital to turn the tide of the war, but came at an enormous cost in blood and bone. By January 1943, McGee had already flown several dangerous sorties, each one chipping away at the odds of survival. The wear and tear of war didn't just affect the machines. It weighed on the minds and spirits of the men who rode inside them. The flak was constant, like steel rain, and the enemy fighters seemed endless. Yet through it all, McGee remained steady, reliable, and faithful to the mission. On the morning of January 3rd, 1943, McGee climbed into his B-17, a bomber nicknamed Snap. Crackle, pop, with no idea that this day would etch his name into history. This particular raid was to target the heavily fortified German U-boat pens in Saint-Nazaire, France, a critical strike point for Allied forces. The flak over the region was notoriously intense, and the Germans defended the area with fierce resistance. As the plane lifted off into the cold European sky, McGee took a position in the rear, scanning the horizon with steely eyes, his hands resting on the twin .50 caliber machine guns that were both his weapon and his shield. It's possible he said a quiet prayer or thought about home, as many airmen did before crossing the threshold of battle. Inside that cramped, icy compartment, separated from his crewmates and fully exposed enemy fire, he embodied the definition of courage. That day, his courage would be tested in ways no one could have imagined. What makes McGee's story so profound isn't just what happened after his plane was hit, but the man he was before it. He didn't have medals lining his chest. He wasn't seeking fame. He was just doing his job, one mission at a time, with humility and resolve. He represents the countless unsung heroes of that war. Men who didn't think they were extraordinary, but who were willing to risk everything for something greater than themselves. His story is a reminder that true heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it sits in the back of a plane, holding the line while the world burns outside. Alan McGee didn't choose to become part of one of the most miraculous survival stories of the 20th century. But when the moment came, when death literally reached out to take him, something deep inside refused to let go. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was faith. Or maybe it was that indestructible thread woven into the hearts of ordinary people who do extraordinary things when the world demands it. Before we see how he fell, we have to understand how he stood. Because only then can we appreciate the full weight of what it means to fall from the sky and live to tell about it. McGee's journey reminds us that courage often wears the face of an ordinary man. He wasn't seeking a spotlight. He simply stepped into the darkness when his country called, and in doing so, he lit a path of survival and hope that still inspires today. It was early on the cold morning of January 3rd, 1943, when Sergeant Alan McGee and the rest of his crew boarded their B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop, for a bombing mission over Nazi-occupied France, a mission that would mark the beginning of one of the most improbable survival stories in military history. Their target, the heavily fortified German submarine pens in the port city of St. Nazaire, a crucial node in the Nazi war machine. These U-boat pens were not only deeply entrenched in layers of reinforced concrete, but were surrounded by dense anti-aircraft artillery batteries and patrolled aggressively by the Luftwaffe. Every man who flew these missions understood the risks. They knew the statistics, the fate of other bombers that had ventured into this deadly airspace and never returned. Yet McGee, like the rest of the 10-man crew, climbed aboard without hesitation. Bundled in layers of gear to guard against the freezing temperatures at 20,000 feet, oxygen masks ready, flak jackets secured, they took off from their base in England into the gray winter sky. As the aircraft climbed higher and formed up with the rest of the squadron, McGee crawled into the narrow tail section of the B-17, a metal tube barely large enough to hold him, and strapped himself in behind the twin .50 caliber machine guns. His view was limited to what he could see through the small plexiglass window behind the bomber, and his job was to defend the aircraft's most vulnerable angle from German fighters that often attacked in swarms. The crew moved into formation as they approached the French coast, each bomber flying in tight coordination to increase their collective firepower and protection. But even formation flying couldn't shield them from the storm they were about to enter. As they reached the outskirts of St. Nazaire, the skies erupted in black clouds of shrapnel and fire. Flak burst fire from the ground that filled the air with deadly fragments. The B-17 bucked and shook as the explosions surrounded it, some near misses, others scoring hits. The concussions were deafening, the aircraft vibrating with each blast as if being punched by invisible giants. Inside the tail, McGee felt each impact as a jolt in his bones, the adrenaline pushing past the fear as he scanned the skies for enemy fighters. Then came the moment that changed everything. A direct hit. An anti-aircraft shell tore through the fuselage, severing the tail section of the B-17 from the rest of the aircraft. 1 second McGee was part of a living machine flying toward the target, and the next he was falling, trapped inside a chunk of broken aircraft plummeting through the sky. He was knocked unconscious either by the explosion itself or by the sudden loss of oxygen and the violent motion of the aircraft breaking apart. Now, hurtling downward at terminal velocity, McGee's body lay limp, still encased in what remained of the tail. At 22,000 feet above the earth, there was no parachute on his back. Standard protocol for tail gunners often required them to leave their chutes inside the fuselage due to the cramped space, a fatal flaw in moments like these. As the rest of the bomber's wreckage scattered across the sky, and the surviving crew members bailed out with parachutes, McGee's fate appeared sealed. Below him, the city of St. Nazaire loomed larger and larger with every passing second. But something remarkable was happening amid the tragedy. Rather than free-falling in open air, McGee's descent was partially slowed by the battered metal tail section, which created drag as it tumbled through the clouds. It wasn't enough to make the fall safe, but it may have been just enough to keep it survivable. As the flaming tail plunged downward, witnesses on the ground later reported seeing what looked like a lifeless body crashing to the glass roof of the St. Nazaire train station. McGee's unconscious form smashed through the rooftop, crashed onto the station stone floor, and lay still, bloodied and broken but somehow not dead. French medics on the scene, likely resistance members working covertly in the area, pulled his body from the wreckage, stunned to find a pulse. He had shattered nearly every bone in his body, had dozens of lacerations and internal injuries, and was barely clinging to life. The German forces occupying the town took him prisoner and transported him to a military hospital, where even the German doctors were amazed that he had survived such a fall. One doctor reportedly told him later, "We thought you were a ghost." As McGee slowly regained consciousness in captivity, the mission continued on in the minds of those who knew him. His crew, many of whom survived the bailout and were captured or killed, never imagined McGee had survived. The mission over France had claimed many lives that day, but in the chaos of war, it had also birthed a miracle. McGee would later reflect on the mission as both the most horrific and defining moment of his life. It was supposed to be another day of service, another contribution to the Allied cause, but it became something far greater. His fall from 22,000 feet was more than an accident. It was a moment that defied logic and confirmed, at least McGee and many who heard his story, that some form of divine hand must have intervened. His journey through the clouds, unconscious and surrounded by fire and steel, wasn't supposed to end with survival. Yet it did. The mission over France was never just about destroying enemy infrastructure. It was about human resolve, sacrifice, and the unpredictable grace that sometimes appears when death seems inevitable. McGee's story, born from that single day's mission, would ripple through time as one of the most stunning examples of endurance, faith, and the mystery of survival in the face of certain death. There are moments in life when time seems to shatter, when the line between life and death becomes so thin that it almost disappears. And for Sergeant Alan McGee, that moment came at 22,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France, inside the tail section of a broken B-17 bomber hurtling toward the ground. After an anti-aircraft shell exploded near the fuselage during a bombing run over St. Nazaire, the tail was torn from the rest of the aircraft, and McGee, unconscious or nearly so, was trapped inside as it began its terrified ascent through the sky. He had no parachute. Standard procedure for tail gunners often required them to leave their parachutes in the central fuselage because the cramped tail section didn't allow for easy maneuvering with the bulky gear. That tragic irony sealed the fate of many gunners during the war, but McGee's story would defy the logic of physics, biology, and even fate itself. Falling from 7 miles high, the air was thin, bitterly cold, and completely unforgiving. Yet somehow, McGee's limp body remained inside the tumbling wreckage, surrounded by jagged, twisted metal. The tail section spun and plummeted with deadly force, but its mass and shape may have created a strange, unintended parachute effect, offering just enough drag to marginally slow the fall. McGee, knocked out cold either from the initial blast, loss of oxygen, or sheer trauma, was spared the terror of consciousness during the fall, but his body took every brutal second of impact. Witnesses on the ground, both German soldiers and French civilians, would later report seeing the B-17 parts raining down from the sky, and in the midst of it, something horrifying, what looked like a human body crashing to the glass roof of the St. Nazaire train station. McGee's body tore through the steel and glass structure with the unstoppable momentum of a falling star, slamming into the stone floor below with enough force to shatter nearly every bone in his body. His right arm was broken, his nose and leg fractured, ribs smashed, and his right lung punctured. A deep gash across his head exposed part of his skull, and shrapnel wounds peppered his body, like a roadmap of violence. By every rational measure, Alan McGee should have died on impact. His fall from 22,000 feet should have ended his story instantly, reducing his body to fragments like so many other unfortunate souls lost to the sky. But against every odd, every law of science and common sense, McGee lived. The impact had been catastrophic, but something, perhaps divine intervention, perhaps physics acting in a fluke of mercy, had preserved just enough of his fragile human form to keep him alive. German soldiers pulled him from the shattered remains of the train station in disbelief, initially assuming he was dead, only to realize moments later that he was breathing. Slowly, barely, but breathing. They rushed him to a German military hospital, where doctors, themselves stunned by the case, operated on him and began the long, delicate process of piecing together the broken man who had fallen from the heavens. McGee would later learn that he had not only survived the fall, but had also avoided permanent brain damage. Despite the severe head trauma, an outcome so improbable that even the surgeons described his survival as miraculous. In captivity, as he slowly regained consciousness and then strength, McGee had time to reflect on the impossible journey he had just endured. He would later say that he felt a divine presence during the fall, a sense that his life had not yet been meant to end, that he was being held in the hands of something greater than war or gravity. His survival became more than a war story. It became a living parable about endurance, faith, and the unexplainable moments that interrupt our carefully ordered understanding of life and death. And as word of his fall and survival spread, fellow soldiers, civilians, and even the German doctors who treated him were in awe. The tale of the man who fell from the sky and lived became a symbol of hope in a world ripped apart by violence. McGee's body bore the marks of his fall for the rest of his life. Scars, aches, and the lingering memories of something no human being should have endured. But his spirit, that remained unbroken. He was later liberated by Allied forces in 1945 and returned home, where he continued living not as a man defined by tragedy, but as one transformed by it. McGee didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't turn his survival into a personal monument. Instead, he quietly honored the miracle, choosing to live with gratitude and humility. The fall that should have ended his story instead launched a legacy that outlived war, reminding generations after him that sometimes, in the middle of unimaginable disaster, there is grace. Sometimes the fall isn't the end. It's the beginning of something greater, something that forces us to reimagine what's possible. McGee's 22,000-foot plunge wasn't just an act of survival. It was a moment of transcendence, a testament to the sheer resilience of the human spirit, and proof that even when everything seems to be falling apart, literally, life can still hold on to you. And maybe, just maybe, your story isn't over yet.